Good afternoon. My name is Tracy Cassidy, and I'm an insider threat researcher here at the CERT Insider Threat Center at the SCI. Today, I'm going to be talking about our technical detection of intended harm to self and/or others. In talking about this, I just want to say that this does involve technical and psychological components, so I wanted to share that I was actually a psychotherapist in a former life and worked with the criminal justice population entering and exiting federal prisons in Northern California. The CERT Insider Threat Center has been conducting research on insider threat for the past 15 years, focusing on national security espionage, cyber sabotage, theft of intellectual property, and fraud. The more and more behavioral indicators that become visible in our online data sources has led us to this current research project. The definition of insider threat is evolving to include employee-on-employee kinetic threats that can cause loss or degradation to organizational resources and capabilities. The DoD includes serious threats to personnel as one of its primary concerns for reporting requirements. Several high-impact incidents of workplace violence that you're all familiar with are the Navy Yard shooting and the Fort Hood shooting, which was also a terrorist attack. The Department of Defense suicide event report in 2015, the newest version, had reported that there were 479 completed suicides and an additional 1,199 suicide attempts across active DoD components, National Guard, and Reserve in that year. The reason we're evaluating suicidality in this context is because it's often difficult to ascertain whether someone is on the pathway to homicide, suicide, or a combination of both, which is often seen with murder-suicide events. Estimates put 93% of people who conduct targeted violence as being suicidal as well. So current technical capabilities of insider threat detection tools, such as user activity monitoring and user behavioral analysis, do not have the known capabilities to detect the heightened risk of workplace violence. They can be augmented by new cyber data and records such as human resources and personnel records. The end goal is to mitigate risk employees pose to an organization, coworkers, or to themselves. In support of the DoD mission and mandated insider threat program efforts, we seek to discover technical and socio-technical indicators which can be used in operational environments to strengthen this capability. More specifically, we want to determine the extent to which insider threat detection tools or detectors are capable of monitoring indicators of self-harm and homicidality through the data sources typically used for insider threat. In doing so, we map the validated indicators across the incident pathway to generate prototypical scenarios. We also are in the process of assessing the capability of existing tools to detect combinations of indicators and scenarios using online data sources. Ultimately, we seek to simulate incidents of workplace violence in a virtual operational environment to understand and assess if and how psychosocial indicators can be monitored. This simulation work relies on NeedleStack, which is a virtual simulation environment developed on the Step Forward platform created here at CERT. NeedleStack is designed to simulate insider threat scenarios for purposes of training, hypothesis testing, and insider threat tool evaluations. It's supported by funding from DARPA Adams and the SCI. Project findings can be used to drive technical requirements that advance the state-of-the-art in automated insider threat data collection and analysis tools. Our research approach combined an analysis of insider workplace violence incidents during our 2015-2016 research initiative with a literature review of indicators and models of workplace violence and suicidality during our current research project. Next, we developed a factor tree model, the incident life cycle, that can be used to systematically generate scenarios across 5 stages, the combination in which we call the pathway to intended harm. To work towards proof of concept, we developed threat scenarios of workplace violence events utilizing the indicators of homicidality and suicidality. Using NeedleStack, we're in the process of inserting these threat scenarios into a noisy operational environment to see if the indicators are potentially visible by data sources used to monitor insider threats, as well as newer data sources such as human resources data. To address coverage issues, we have developed scenarios in various levels of imminence and severity, ranging from bullying to fatal shootings and suicidal ideations to suicide attempts, to ensure that the scenarios provided appropriate coverage across the different aspects of the pathway. I skipped ahead there. We also did a preliminary evaluation of ways in which we anticipated indicators might be seen in the needle stack environment. We determined ways in which we would consider the detector insider threat detection tool performing well on a particular scenario, which I'll discuss in a few more minutes. And since I skipped ahead to the factor tree model, the factor tree model includes the primary elements seen in the literature and in the incidents. The smaller background information, which I don't expect any of you to be able to read, are key indicators of homicidality and suicidality, many of which overlap. You can see here that we broke the indicators into different paths, which we call the pathway to intended harm. They include predispositions, stressors, grievance, ideation, and planning and preparation. And this is our pathway to intended harm against self and or others that we developed based on the vetted indicators and research. For those of you familiar with threat assessment literature, this is loosely based on Calhoun and Weston's pathway to intended violence. And it includes indicators of suicidality as well. So it's not all inclusive, but it rather highlights groups of indicators in each of the categories. Not everyone will have indicators in each section of this path. However, as it moves towards intended violence, we expect that these indicators will be more indicative of imminence and a higher likelihood of a hostile attack. Finally, we map the scenarios onto the pathway to assess how well the combination of scenarios covers the primary components of the pathway. And these are just two examples. So as we continue to evaluate the visibility of indicators via technical means, we have mapped examples of indicators and potential data sources that may provide information. For example, conflict with supervisor might be seen in some of these data sources, such as performance evaluations, grievance filings, HTTP logs. And finally, the way in which we'll know if the detector or insider threat detector tool performs well on a particular scenario is if it discovers indicators earlier in the pathway, thus allowing for an early intervention or a monitor and wait approach for threat assessment teams or insider threat teams to deal with the employee's behavior. Second, if it discovers later more urgent indicators, allowing for more immediate response to the person's behavior. And finally, if it discovers indicators across the pathway in its entirety, giving more information about the employee. And finally, if it's able to prioritize the threat actor's behaviors. For those of you familiar with user activity monitoring, this would mean creating an alert. This is outside the scope of the research that we're doing now. So as you can see from the diagram, we're only partway through our work. We are currently taking our scenarios and writing scripts that will allow for them to be ingested into NeedleStack. And then we'll use workplace violence simulations in NeedleStack to assess the capability and identify data points associated with suicidality and homicidality. With those scenarios and time and tool permitting, we hope to use NeedleStack tool engagements for evaluation means to test the tools and see if they're capable of identifying the indicators of workplace violence against a haystack of realistic data in a typical operational environment. We anticipate the detectors will perform well at detecting later stage, more imminent indicators versus early stage, possibly more ambiguous indicators. And we also acknowledge that not all indicators of homicidality and suicidality are going to be visible by the detectors. Indicators, require that the information is known in the workplace, and so obviously that doesn't happen with all indicators. So some of the indicators can be seen through HR records, poor performance reviews, web searches, or via background checks that are done prior to employment. Things like history of abuse, for example, is not something that we're going to see in these detectors, nor should we necessarily be able to. So technical detection is only a piece of the detection puzzle needed to potentially mitigate these actions. As you all know, with more and more data sources of reported information, they should be assessed to potentially integrate into the Insider Threat Hub at organizations. So, it's really important for all of us to see something, say something. So, and wrapping up, these are the contributors on this project. I'd like to especially thank Andy Moore, who has been integral in this work, and Sarah Miller, Mike Hansel, Carrie Gardner, and Dr. Jack Rosell is a UPMC local psychiatrist who helped vet the indicators. And I have 6 seconds left. 6 seconds left. Does anyone have any questions? Sure.
So presumably you will look at all the incidents that already happened. Assuming you do forensics on incidents that happen in the workplace in terms of violence to show how this model captures the behaviors leading up to these incidents. Is it possible to take what you guys are doing here in workplace to see would you have an opportunity to detect incidents that happened recently in Las Vegas and et cetera, in Orlando?
I'm sure that you could, obviously do that, and I'm sure the people that are doing forensics, on Las Vegas and stuff, they're combing through everything that's done. One thing that really aids this work is that I believe it's almost 98% of people leak information online if they have an intent to harm someone else. So there's really an opportunity to gather that information, and they may not directly be saying like, I'm going to go shoot whoever, like the gentleman who shot Gabby Giffords. Oh, sorry. He had been talking about doing something, not necessarily what he was going to do. So I definitely think that there's definitely more use, and it's it's a kind of a new area, so we have to really refine these behavioral indicators to figure out how they're seen, because there's like disgruntlement is hard to kind of transfer over. So that's part of the work.
Are you also talking to the Army and other services in terms of PTSD patients, and that would give you some information as well in terms of their background? Yeah.
Sure. I know the Veterans Affairs has done a lot of work on that, not specifically, like more on the indicators than actually transferring them over, but that would definitely be great continuing work.